Rainy November. Reach out, touch faith. Hello YouTube, it's me, Russ, and today reviewing a popular podcast that hits close to home, all right? #1 in religion and spirituality for a number of weeks. A place my wife and I used to go, a place I was involved in, and we made friends there. I still have friends that are from there. It's gone, all right? The church collapsed in 2014. The podcast is called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church. It's been #1 in spirituality and religion for a number of weeks. But there's been some people talking about it. There's been some reviews on it. And I figured, as someone who was an actual member there, who went to the church, who still considers myself a Christ follower, to use those words. I'm not sure about Christian anymore. I kind of want to take the word back, to be honest, but there's just a lot of really bad stuff with the label Christian on it these days. So, but getting into the review of the podcast by Christianity Today, I have friends who were on the podcast, who were interviewed in the podcast, and they were sharing some stuff on Facebook. And at first I was like reluctant, you know, because it's done by Christianity Today, which is a pretty prestigious, I suppose, successful, well-known publication in you know, popular evangelical Christendom, so to speak. So immediately that has me thinking, uh-oh, you're right. But after listening to it, and I've listened to all the episodes that they've posted so far, I'm up to the last one they posted on October 19th. I was pleasantly surprised, all right? As someone who's been there and knows some of the people, right, who had my own experience going through all of that, I like it. So far, I see it as a really good way of telling the story from, you know, these people are news folks. They're journalists. They went to school for this stuff. And I really see it as a good piece of journalism. Mike Cosper is a guy from the podcasting community that I've heard of. And that's one of the things that had me, oh, well, you know, I can listen to that. I've liked some of his stuff before. So I do like the way they've done this, and they've treated my friends with respect, and listening to them and letting them speak of their experience. I think they did, so far they've done a pretty good job with that. I've been reacting to some other critiques of the podcast. Not that I'm trying to defend the podcast, but there's just a lot of people that weren't there, that are listening to this as whatever they see it as, right? Like it's a true crime podcast or something like that. And people talking about biases, and that, you know, Cosper and these guys are biased, and it's liberal. Like that's another one too that really kind of bugs me, to be honest with you. That, you know, conservative, liberal, people putting these names and labels on stuff. Personally, I like to consider myself too conservative for my liberal friends and too liberal for my conservative friends. It's a good place for me to be, I feel. But the fact that, you know, a lot of Christians don't like it is sort of should raise alarm bells, you know? Like the folks who aren't liking this stuff, there seems to be a kind of thing in Christian culture where we want to keep stuff that's negative, you know, like the God of nice, right? Let's just keep God nice and not talk about the fact that people do suffer through spiritual abuse in churches, that a lot of churches go through a lot of horrible stuff and do a lot of really bad stuff to good people, all right? And these things happen. So to say it's a critique of Christianity, I just don't get it. Like that's fine for them, but for me, you know, it just sounds like, well, we worship the God of nice, and we don't want to, you know, say anything bad about poor Mark Driscoll. Now, there's a lot of criticism of Mark in this, of course, because you know, the church was based around him, and it brings up some really good conversations around celebrity pastors and big church budgets and production and pageantry, money and power. Is this stuff, quote, church? Right? Is that how we define a, quote, church? I mean, you look in the Bible, the church is people. We gather people. If people are gathering and hanging out, or, I mean, the definition of church today, looking at the landscape of popular American Christian culture, I believe was heavily influenced by what went on at Mars Hill Church and the way Mark taught. Acts 29 was Mark Driscoll's idea, for example. So Seattle is a city that a lot of churches have tried to church plant over the years. There's a bunch of organizations have come out here and tried to start, you know, Christian organizations and churches, and failed miserably, spent a lot of money. And here comes this guy who, you know, starts this thing in his living room, and it just grows like crazy. Part of why it grew like crazy was the internet, right? And positioning themselves at the beginning of a lot of that. Part of this was just history, right? The way the internet was unfolding at the time, and also the Seattle music scene, all right? There was clubs in the city, all ages clubs. Rock Candy was a club that this band here, Pearl Jam, played at. All ages clubs started getting shut down by some really stringent, strict rules in the city, and having them have just insurance they couldn't afford. But Mars Hill was a church, right? And they would have all ages shows at this little club attached to the church called the Paradox. And it wasn't just Christian music, all right? These were punk bands, they were thrash bands, they were hardcore bands, they were straight edge bands, just about anyone they could sign in any other club that could play an all ages club was there. Death Cab for Cutie played there. There's some other bands that I just can't think of right offhand that you probably have heard of that played at the Paradox, all right? Now, those folks who went to those shows also got curious about this church, right? Like, here's a church, you know, and Mark sometimes would show up at some of the shows and say a few things, and that was part of the growth of Mars Hill's explosive growth in the city as well. Not been told about yet, talked about yet. But part of it was Mark and his message. People talk about him being a dynamic speaker. I think he had a gift, but not necessarily a speaking gift as much as a confidence gift. I mean, he was a very confident man in what he was saying. He was funny, he was an entertainer, and he could keep an audience, much like a stand-up comedian could. He talked about that. I remember him talking about that, saying that, you know, pastors should watch stand-up comedians. Like, here's an art form where a guy gets up and stands in front of a bunch of people and talks for a period of time and has to hold their attention. Like, people should, pastors, you should study them, which is interesting. It's thought-provoking. It gets people thinking. It gets people thinking about, right, the mission, so to speak. But as far as men in the city, a lot of, you know, non-Christians became Christians because of Mars Hill, you know. I remember one guy talking about that on the podcast, saying, yeah, I got yelled at in a meeting today, but we packed the house in baptisms, right? They're baptizing people till midnight because, you know, they're in a city. That was another thing. It's another thing beautiful about what Mars Hill did is focusing on the city and talking about how it's important to evangelize, or, you know, get to people in cities. The Bible, books of the Bible are written to cities. Ephesians, Philippians, Galatians, right? These are cities. Why is all of the churches moving out to the suburbs, right? Well, the cities is the place where the media is, where colleges are, where fashion, design, where these things take place. Why don't we do this stuff in the city? Great point. And something that Mars Hill was after. They also used a lot of something some Willow folks did, which was pop culture. and, you know, realizing that there's being stories being told out there that are grabbing people's attention, that are stirring people's affections and hearts and minds. And one of them at the time was Fight Club, you know? I remember Mark talking about that in a sermon. I have a quote from Fight Club that Mark would say that I've heard, especially in men's, show you some of my Mars Hill stuff, the men's advance. This is the men's training day, but they didn't call it a retreat. They call it an advance. See what they did there. But yeah, this is from Mars Hill Church. The imagery on it is, before I used to think, wow, that kicks ass. That's cool. And now I'm like, I don't know, toxic masculinity stuff going on there. But there's something to, you know, gender roles and the attitudes of men and how men are supposed to be in a certain way. And when you can preach a message to a guy like Tyler Durden did in Fight Club, right? Advertising has us chasing cars, clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history. No purpose or place. We had no great war, no great depression. Our war is a spiritual war, right? He said. Our Great Depression is our lives. We all have been raised on television to believe that one day we'd be millionaires, movie gods, and rock stars, but we won't. We're slowly realizing that, and we are very, very pissed off, you know? I mean, when Mark said that in a church, right? I got chills. It was just where I was at, man. And yeah, our great war is a spiritual war. And for Tyler Durden, it was anarchy, right? The way that movie ends isn't super positive, is it? But, you know, Mark had a vision, and he talks about this in the podcast. Like, there's a whole episode on I Am Jack's Raging Bile Duct, that episode. I was in the audience when he was screaming that. My wife and I both were. That whole, who do you think you are?
How dare you? Who in the hell do you think you are? Abusing a woman, neglecting a woman, being a coward, a fool, being like your father, Adam.
I was there. My wife and I were both there. You know, I walked up away feeling, I don't know, is that supposed to be convicting? I was a little bit taken aback, but there's that thing that I think a lot of people do, not just Christian people, but maybe in the comments, correct me if I'm wrong, where we're kind of judging, like, that guy really needs to hear that, right? Like, I live in a city where we put a bunch of money towards buses and public transportation and stuff like that. Yet, a lot of times you look on the bus and there's no one riding the bus, right? So there's a bunch of people who sit in traffic and they voted for the bus and they voted for public transit and they sit there in gridlock traffic going, why aren't you on the bus, right? To the guy next to them. So I think when Mark and Christians do stuff like that, there's a lot of messages that come out that are like that, right? Like, you need to be on the bus, right? Well, I'm fine, but you need to hear that, you know, and I'll keep, you know, propping up and putting money into this place that has messages like that. The bus, when he said there'll be a pile of bodies under the bus, right? So people have asked me about, like, so you were there, like, yeah, I heard that sermon, and did you go back? I remember my wife and I having that conversation walking out, like, that just didn't feel right, you know? But also, you have to understand that Mark was not, in the beginning anyway, he became a pop Christian kind of icon of the time. But in the earlier days, we started in 2006. So I'm not sure when he started saying stuff like that. But I do remember him not, like, a lot of Christians didn't like him. Like, a lot of really religious people that I thought were kind of hoity-toity, you know, squares, or, you know, don't like rock and roll, right? You all be sinning, those kinds of folks. They Yeah, they didn't like Mark. They didn't like me. That's for sure. I didn't feel safe going to any kind of church where everyone's dressing up on Sunday and you know, voting conservative all the time. And right, like these are things that weren't real appealing to people like myself. So I remember when there was like protesters outside the church, when Mark said stuff like that, you know, I'm assuming he's talking about them. I really didn't know he was talking about his own elders in the church until I met some of them. Like I know Paul, who was in one of the episodes. He's a friend of mine now, and I know his family, and you know, we as the, you know, the congregants were very excluded from knowing about what was going on behind the scenes, which is maybe a warning that people going to church should know about. When everyone's really tight-lipped about what goes on in the boardroom, so to speak, you know, we got worried, all right? Maybe. We should look into that. The less transparent churches are, you know, there's not a whole lot of transparency in popular Christian culture when it comes to these big organizations. I believe that's a problem. That was something that, you know, if some of this stuff was transparent, maybe they could have nipped it in the bud sooner. I saw one of the critiques of the podcast, and this guy's like, well, we just don't know what to do with the internet, as everybody has a voice now. And it's like, yeah, everyone has a voice now. It's really hard for you to keep stuff in the dark. People are sick of that, you know? It's hard for, when a church goes through a situation, someone can broadcast their experience. Some of the problem, I believe, is not having common ground where you can bring the two parties in and hear both sides of the story. You know, when we hear just one side of the story, we're not getting the whole story. Should there be a court of public opinion? Is that what you're saying, Russ? I don't know. I think that people can discern for themselves, right? It's called critical thinking. It's another thing that's not super popular in Christian culture, critical thinking, right? Having people think for themselves. But it's important for us to be able to discern value in our relationships with others, with the organizations that call themselves spiritual, right? Or am I off base on that? Again, comment section. I'd love to hear from you.
And shame on you if you've not become a member and submitted to spiritual authority. And shame on you if you've not joined a community group so you can walk in darkness. And shame on you!
Episode 5, the episode about women and how women are treated or seen. You know, we're seen at Mars Hill. These are my basement books. And yeah, The Real Marriage and the workbook. There's people that hear some of these stories and they're like, well, what about your wife, Russ? Like, what did she go through, you know? And just hearing that episode is heart-wrenching. My wife is never involved in women's groups or church stuff at all. So she was spared from a lot of that. That's kind of her experience with it. She just didn't have a whole lot. I listened to the sermons, went to church with me. The Ruth series that Mark preached was really helpful for her. She really said that that was a turning point in our marriage, and it helped keep us together. Like, she really unhappy, and we worked our way through some stuff, and again, that's Mars Hill, a good positive Mars Hill thing. But you know, as far as sex and things that were in that book, yeah, that's wasn't something that she was involved in, right? But the way the book was promoted and the way culture gave it credibility, the book Real Marriage, that was when a lot of people exited. Some good friends of mine left. I remember having tears over that. So Mark paid $250 million of church funds, and people would say, oh, but those books were, you know, that's their argument was, but those books were already sold, and it wasn't really church funds. Well, you misled people into believing they were pre-ordering a book, right? And then you bought your way onto the New York Times bestseller list and kept that tight-lipped right, secret, top secret envelope. I mean, that's just, when that story broke, again, the internet, right? Oh, the cursed internet. These people. But that story broke as an important story. Like, we should know that you spent $250,000 of church funds for your ego, right? Or, you know, Mark would say, well, it's for the mission of God, right? We need to get that message of complementarianism out there so that the world, you know, and more people can meet Jesus. And that's why we did it. Well, then be upfront about that. Like, don't, you know, I mean, a lot of people just, that was shady. That was misleading. And a lot of folks left. What was my involvement in the church? How did I get involved? Some of you might be thinking, why am I wearing a Kurt Cobain shirt? You might be thinking, I got involved with what was called grace groups. It was like a Thursday night thing. They're in Ballard, and people that deal with addiction, people that suffer from, you know, unwanted behaviors, you know, anxiety, depression, these kinds of things, and people would meet, and a lot of recovery folks there. I remember, you know, fond memories of that. There's people that were homeless that would come in and that got help through grace groups. There was a homeless man that would come in. I remember he came to grace groups once, just guys just coming off the street, you know. And then he started like taking out the garbage in the church. Like, he'd walk in on Sunday, kind of walk behind the counter and start taking out the garbage. Like, can I help you? Homeless man coming back. And I just want to serve, you know. And he did. And he would take out the garbage, and eventually he got off heroin. That's one of my last memories of grace groups was praying for this man, as he didn't look like he did when he started grace groups, right? Had an apartment and was getting off of methadone, right? He wanted prayer to help him get off of methadone. And it was just beautiful, right? And now the church is gone, and the streets are littered with tents and heroin addicts, and it's just really sad. Grace groups were replaced by redemption groups. I didn't get involved in redemption groups. I didn't get involved as a leader at Mars Hill at all. I was always kind of, I know it was like that Groucho Marx thing I had going on. You know, if somebody wants me to be a member, I wouldn't join a club that would want me as a member, kind of a thing. I still was real leery of organized religious hierarchy. I thought that some of the qualifications for deacon and pastor were weird. My buddy Leo became a deacon. He's another guy that struggled with addiction, as I have in my life. I've talked about that here on the podcast. Almost 35 years now since I've used amphetamines, right? Crack cocaine, meth. I was pretty heavily addicted to that stuff. At 16, I went to rehab for alcohol. I drank myself to death for 2 minutes. 2.5 minutes, I was flatline dead. And yeah, they put me either rehab or jail. So I have a heart for broken people. I have a heart for people who struggle with addiction. Christians want to look at me funny for wearing my Kurt Cobain shirt to church. Right? That stirs things in me. Distrustful things in me, right? I mean, redemption groups were helpful for a lot of folks, but I still feel that we didn't have community like we did with grace groups. I had a lot of critiques towards 12-step. It's something I had been a part of. I like that grace groups wasn't 12 steps, but it was a kind of weekly sort of thing. But I think that thing was good for people, because redemption groups happened maybe every quarter or every other quarter, and gathering leaders for them, and the way that the church was stringent about who could be a redemption group's leader and who couldn't, you know, disqualified most people who had suffered from addiction. And in my critique there, but that's just me, all right? Just from my experience. I wouldn't have wanted me, I felt, as a redemption group leader. I didn't pursue redemption group leader status. And that was one of the reasons. So my friend Leo and I had a community group and became sort of it was weird. Like, we had to be sort of secret about it, sadly. So people that struggle with addiction from other community groups in our campus, which was the Shoreline campus at the time, later became the Everett campus here in Everett. But we would get folks who, the other community groups were like, hey, this guy or gal's got something going. It's usually men that had something going on that we, maybe you guys could help. And Leo and I did. But it's weird that that had to be, it seemed like it was sort of on the DL, right? Like, we weren't supposed to talk about that with, upper leadership, even though the campus pastor knew about it. So this is towards the end, all right? 2011, 2012, 2013, I can't remember. Leo and I were there. I mean, it's one of those things where, like, we didn't like what was going on. We were fairly vocal about it. Nobody stood in our way and said, shut up or anything, right? Because they probably knew us. But a lot of folks would say, the church needs guys like you. Like, I'm glad you're there. Like, I'm out. Like, this place is horrible. What's going on is not good, but you should stay. And like, what? Okay, and we kind of stayed because we thought we were making an impact or an influence. And I don't know. I was out in 2014. I wrote my my letter, and Leo started getting sick. So Leo passed away in 2016 from cancer. He had kidney cancer. So yeah, Mars Hill brand was very Calvinist, Reformed Calvinist. Guys started wearing the Reformed t-shirts and stuff. You see that still today. Like, we came up with that. I don't know. Shirts with Spurgeon on them and things like this. It was just a lot of Calvinism. And it became, as the leadership got weirder and weirder, it became more and more fundamentalist, right? I mean, it was fundamentalist with beers and cigars. That was a men's kind of thing that we did for a while too. But, I mean, just traditionally with the way the church saw men and women, and complementarianism is under attack. I'm hearing that from some of the critics too. And that CT is somehow not complementarian because of the reports that are coming from this podcast, which, and so here's another one. If a woman goes to college and she earns a prestigious degree and she wants to work and go to work in banking or something like that, technology, something that pays a lot, and she marries a guy who I don't know, has been changing tires all his life, and they have a child. So should the guy go back to changing tires, or should the woman go back to IT, right? Is that somehow not honoring women if the guy stays home? This is somehow a sin against Jesus. I mean, show me that in the Bible. That's just one of those things that it just doesn't make sense to me. So I would love for these churches, like, I don't know where they're coming from when they say they're offended by the non-complementarian attitudes of Christianity today in the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, because I really don't see it, to be honest with you. Comment below. Okay. The good stuff about the church, again, grace groups was a great thing. Community groups was a big part of how Mars Hill operated. I like it when churches can bring people together, to share a meal or something, like once a week. I would attend a community group, and a couple of them, and met some really cool people in some of those groups. Some of those groups didn't mesh very well and didn't stick around, right? But some of them did, and I still have friends from those experiences today from those groups, and they're dear friends, and I love those folks and their families, and that's one of the pluses that I'm glad Mars Hill was a thing, because would I have known them if Mars Hill wasn't the case. One of the things that we did through our community group was the church got on us to try and do something missional, right? Sort of a churchy word for something in the community. Do something that makes a difference in the community. And at the time, my son, who was in middle school at the time, had a friend whose mom was going through a situation, like a heavy situation, and you know, she had issues with an ex, and she had to get out of that situation right away, and they didn't have any money. Well, we have a motorhome parked by our house, and it's 32-foot motorhome. It's as big as a small apartment, right? Problem is, it had been sitting there for a few years, and it was kind of moldy. We're using it for storage, kind of. The roof leaked, things like this. And, you know, this community group, the guys, everyone came, and we, you know, restored that space so that this family could live in it for a little while. And not that I wouldn't have done that anyway, right? Like, did I need the church to, you know, when my son comes to me and said, hey, my friend's got nowhere to go, was I just going to send him away because you know, not a Christian or something? Like, I don't think that's part of it, but I think that the church helped a lot. Like, having that community with me by my side while that was going on was incredibly helpful. And the young man is still a friend today. Like, him and I talk and have conversations, and he's a great guy, great kid. I call him a kid. He's like 26 now or something like that. But yeah, that's one of those things that I count as a blessing. Mark himself, I think, had some work to do, you know, and that's where things went wrong. Like, Mark himself had been through some stuff. I have empathy for Mark. I'm not sure I have sympathy for Mark, all right? Mark was very, I mean, I've heard stories, and I'm not going to throw them out here. It's kind of, it would be gossipy, honestly. But, you know, those people want to tell their stories, that's fine. But just brutal kind of bullying stuff. And, you know, the church grew so fast, and the man, you know, I mean, any person having their ego pumped up like that, not that I'm not giving him an excuse or a pass or anything like that. Just like, I get it, right? But that's when you need people. In the podcast talks about this, right? There's another gal in the podcast who I know, and I know her family, and I know her son Justin, and you know, talking about, hey, you need some people to call you on stuff, right? You need someone to go toe to toe with you, and she's fired for that. And that was a whole thing, all right? That instance in her life, more than I can discuss here, and more than that's in the podcast, all right?
I don't care how successful you are in this area. If you are a failure, it clouds all of your dignity. It robs all of your masculinity. There is no excuse for any man who claims the name of Christ to treat a woman in a dishonorable, disrespectful way.
And now here's where we go with Christian culture and forgiveness, all right? Because I believe that Christian culture at large has a very poor definition of what it means to forgive someone else, all right? To forgive someone who's offended you is mostly for the offended party, all right? It's more for the victim than it is the oppressor or the person who caused the damage. Do you get that? You heard that old saying, Unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. Unforgiveness is a toxicity in the soul. It's just constantly, right? Like it can eat a person alive. That's what unforgiveness does. Forgiveness is releasing that burden on your own soul. So when you forgive someone, you're releasing your hands from their throat. Does that make sense? When you forgive someone, you're not going, oh, we're cool. It's cool. Everything's fine. I mean, that's what it seems like when I hear some of these critiques is like, is that what you folks believe forgiveness is, right? I mean, people that believe that are opened up to all sorts of abuse. I mean, we've talked about domestic violence. Forgive someone without them doing any work of reconciliation on their part. You just allow them back in your life again. Because to forgive and forget, that's what you're supposed to do. Like that's not in 1 Timothy 4, all right? There's no forgive and forget. That's not true, all right? Forgiveness is not wishing aught on the person who's offended you. Like you no longer want to strangle or hurt them. But forgiveness can very well be picking up the phone if there's an instance of sexual abuse of a child, for example. I mean, churches go through that and they don't pick up the phone because forgiveness, or because I prayed for him and I forgave him. And so, Mark, let's use Mark as an example, right? So let's say you got a bus driver and he's screaming at and beating the children, right? Now he gets fired. This is a Christian bus. Right? We'll say it's for a big Christian organization. We've forgiven you. We've forgiven the bus driver. Now, do we give him the keys and just let him go drive the bus again? Or do we require him to get some help, to do some work on himself, on his own soul, and maybe apologize directly to the kids, make amends with some of the kids that he's hurt that were on the bus, right? Some of the kids who are scared now, and some of the kids who, you know, got a black eye. In addiction circles, we call this making amends. Mark didn't do that. Mark hurt a lot of people, and then he quit. And he said, bye-bye, Seattle, I'm going to Phoenix. He said God told him to. Okay, that's your God told you to. I don't know, that's not the way I see relationships. When relationships are valued, there's a lot in the Bible about relationships and valuing our neighbors and our community. This is not something that Mark Driscoll did. Sadly, it's not something a lot of Christians do in culture today. Sorry, it's the truth. I haven't seen it. I don't see popular Christian culture as very friendly to hurting people in my country. And so I'm glad that Christianity Today is doing this podcast. So far, I think it's a good thing. I don't agree with everything in it, but do I think it's bias or somehow, so I addressed some of those things. All right. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more, talk about some more later, and there'll be a link on the side here in the description where you can hear more. And this is not something I normally talk about on this channel. This is a vlog thing about my life and something I'm going through. And this podcast being so popular has stirred up a lot of old tissue, so to speak. I could say old wounds, right? And some of my friends and myself, and a lot of us are talking about it. And but I think it's important. I think it's important that Christian culture at large hears this message. I think Christianity is a good thing. I think following Jesus is a good thing. I think Jesus is a good guy to follow. But I just don't see a lot of Christ-like teachers and influences and institutions and systems these days. And that's my 2 cents. Thanks for watching.